Thanks, everyone. Welcome to our first executive and leadership workshop hosted by Dr. Liran Edelist. Appreciate everyone. Appreciate you, of course. Excited to kick this off. And for those that are going to be watching this recording, feel free. You can always reach out with any questions, and we're happy to kind of go from there. But with that being said, I will let you have the floor, and feel free to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Brian. Excited to be here and to kick those set of sessions. And we're going to speak today about the superhero and the mentor. I guess that some of you that are watching it, either with me live or in the recording, are kind of saying superhero, mentors, how does it all come together? So I promise to explain all about it in a few moments. But maybe before we jump into that, I'll have a quick introduction about myself. So you already know my name is Liran. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, but originally I'm from Israel, which many of you know as the startup nation, like hundreds of different innovations coming from this state. In my personal story, I was a founder of sort of a managed service SaaS type of a company that was getting merged and then acquired. And one of my technology vendors asked me to come to the US and establish their subsidiary. So I did that, moved my family to the US, established a subsidiary, was part of large money investments, about $130 million. And right now, I'm here with you talking a little bit about the superhero I met over my career and mentorship. Let me jump back into the idea of this conversation, and maybe starting with a little bit of a story from my previous experience as a mentor with a startup. Was a kind of a challenging process that I will speak about it maybe later, but this was one of the founders that when I asked him about his personal and professional goals, he said, I really want to change the way the world is, and then three dots. I will not expose right now what exactly it was. And then I literally realized that the founders and the entrepreneurs that we are working with, they're not a regular human, right? They're not people that are just seeking for a job. They are not just trying to say, hey, let's do something fun. They really want to change the world. They really want to do something substantial. And to me, a person that is waking up in the morning or just sitting for or sleeping a couple of years and dreaming about an idea, and then he decide one day to say, okay, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to do something that is going to be so impactful. So the way I'm seeing those guys as superheroes. And that's why, I want to speak in this conversation about the founders that we as mentors working with them very often, literally as superheroes. And what about ourselves as mentors? We're just human, right? It's not just. We usually come with a lot of experience, but we need to understand that sometimes there are some gaps in the way we see reality and the way a superhero that might or may not be a fictional type of a character. We are just different. So we need to understand those differences in order to make sure that our contribution and collaboration works as we expected. So this whole conversation is about bridging the gap between the founders and the mentors. And the way to think about that, when I teach my MBA students some business models, I said, a business model is something that helps us to think more clearly about a specific business problem or environment. So I think that superhero could be a nice model to think about once we are interacting with founders. For the guys that are here online, please feel free to jump in. There will be a couple of stops that I'll try to open that as an open conversation. So hopefully we can have that also as a discussion and not just as a one-side track. So what are we going to speak about? We're going to speak about the hero, about the founders. We want to understand if it's a superhero, what are the superpowers that are there, what are the weaknesses by nature, and to understand something very nicely that Stanley was saying about the multidimensionality of the hero. So we'll speak about that. And then if we have heroes, then unfortunately we always need to have villains. So we speak about how we identify the real villain in the story. And maybe last but not least, you will hear about another piece of that is thinking a little bit about the story and the storyteller. So again, those are like the typical, I would say, facets of a good superhero movie or story. But in our conversation, we are also going to speak in those area about the mentors and how we as mentors could becoming part of this story. So let's start with our first slide and superhero, right? So I mentioned why I consider those founders as superheroes, but if I'm saying they're a superhero, it is not just because they have a good idea. Usually they bring with them something else. And I believe that one of the very basic needs that we have to comply as mentors is to understand our superhero powers. It means like, what does he really excel in? What does he do that makes him to be different than a regular person? So we can think about that in different ways. Again, this is a model. It has to be also a little bit fun for the guys who are watching it. So we can think about those strengths as maybe speed, right? We see sometimes superheroes that are very quickly acting, right? You give them an idea and the day after they already executing that, right? So the writing, kind of processes very quickly. Sometimes it's their problem, by the way, that they're thinking too fast. They're shooting, too quickly. The other type of superhero is those who are, looking forward, or more forward-looking. Sorry, means that they are more like the strategic, the visionary, the planner guys. To be honest, I haven't met a lot of founders that were very long-term thinkers, but I have been seeing a lot of them that are very visionary, especially with the technology or the type of innovations that they're bringing. So. But I'm sure that there are a lot of people very different. Then I have there are the Tony Stark type of persons that are more the innovative guys, the guys that sometimes we can call them like a little bit of tech nerds, those who are very fluent with technology, bringing the innovation very quick, and so on. There are some guys that as founders, and I'm very fortunate to work with some of them that I'm calling them like the social superheroes. Those are the guys that are really trying to bring innovation that, it will have a monetary value, but it comes out of the need to make our world a better place. So usually those founders will be focusing on areas like environment, education, diversity, and so on. Then there is the superhero that is more like a champion, a guy that is already been doing a lot behind him, sort of a leader in his field, very recognized, and so on. And by nature, that's a sort of a power to be a kind of a figure. And there could be many other type of forces. Could be that our superhero will have one or maybe more than one, but I think the very first thing we as mentors need to know is like, okay, what are those kind of strengths? Taking that to the next level, so once we identify, okay, I have a superhero that is very strong in those areas, I think the next piece that we want to know is that, okay, how those powers came to this superhero, and I will explain why we want to do that in a second. But so how he got those powers? So it could be that our superhero was just find it by accident, like Spider-Man that got the spider bite. So in many ways, it could be that our superhero was just driving or walking or had like a sort of an event that made him, to think differently and to act differently. It could be that those guys have been learning, right? Like researchers, as an example, that were just working in research organizations for ages and came up with an idea. And there are some guys that are just talented by birth. So those are the kind of guys that we probably want to understand, like where this power is coming from. And then we also want to understand when are they using their power, are they using those powers, right? So do we see those kind of forward people thinking, always kind of making strategic plans, always trying to make sure that everyone understands the plan and so on, or they're just expressing that when they need to speak with an investor or to build a presentation or so on. And it could be that we as mentors sometimes finding those founders that are not really using their talents, and they, like a very techie guy trying to become a marketing person, and that's by nature a mistake, right? So the reason I'm saying that we need to understand the sources of the power is because we need to care about our character, we need to care about the superhero. And once we get it, we understand the level of expertise of our superhero. We should know if he's coachable, as well as if he needs extra support or focus. Brian, I see that you raised the hand. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think my question, kind of going back to the last slide and this, is do you have superheroes, obviously, that probably have multiple of those skill sets, right? Either they're the creative and the leader, right? And how do you determine when to find, so like this is singular founders, right? But when you have companies with multiple co-founders, do you try to find matches with different superpowers, or what happens when you have multiple creatives, multiple visionaries, right? Multiple leaders? Is the ideal team a combination of those, or can you have a lot of the same superhero personalities?
I think it's a great question, especially because I will speak a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. The way I see that is, we first need to understand those different characters, when you're talking about different co-founders and so on, right? So we need to understand each individual, what he brings with him. And the second piece, we're going to speak about that in a moment, is we should understand who is the villain, right? What are they trying to figure out? And then I can come back to your question and say, okay, here are the challenges, here are the powers that are standing. Are those sufficient enough to be able to win the game, right? And I think that's literally where the challenge is. But you definitely need to understand where people are coming from. I do have, by the way, a kind of a story about it, and one of the reasons that I built that in that area is that one of the startup I'm working with, it's highly related to let's call it information security, authentications of user within system, and so on. Great idea. The guy who brought this idea to life was doing that probably a decade ago. So, it was an idea that was changing a sort of focus for many years. He is not coming with any technology background, right? So this is amazing. A guy that is just, let's say a simple user becoming like a superhero and thinking about the technology that he literally has no clue about, right? And I think that on one hand, and this is like a difficult case, because you're saying, well, it could be that it's a great idea, but sometimes when you see a person that does not have the expertise in his field or the powers in his fields, that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So maybe this idea is not as good as he thinks because he's not an expert. But then going back to your question, Brian, then he brought in his team some people that has a very rich background in cybersecurity, right? So that's how literally you say, okay, well, when you see those two guys together, then you understand that maybe one is the visionary and the other one is more the executioner and the expert. So that's kind of where it comes. And I think that, once we hear the idea and the challenges from a person, we need to understand where he comes from. And, if he doesn't have expertise in a specific field, I, as a mentor, will always be a little bit doubtful about it, right? But with that, let me ask maybe you, Brian, or Michael, or anyone else in this call, a question about us as mentors, right? Should mentors help the superheroes, those founders, to find their powers and maybe to teach them how to use it? So is it really my job? So I think that my job is at least to understand those superpowers, but is it my job to sit with a founder and tell him, you're very strong at X, but you may not be so strong at Y? Or should I tell him that, hey, you're very unique in those specific areas? Do you know that, right? What do you think? Like, is it kind of our roles as mentors to speak about those?
Yeah, that's a great, I can go first, and I'm sure Michael has some good thoughts on it. But I think for me, right, to your first point, right, I think of one of the first mentors that I had too. And for me, it wasn't a mentor in my startup experience with the company, but it was actually for my career at the time. And I think the one thing that my mentor did a really good job of was really at that time, I was, this was my first really stint or my first managerial job in my career. And he really helped me understand, to your point, what were my superpowers, right? What were my strengths? Because I think a lot of times we kind of know ourselves, but hearing someone else really validates that. And so he was, hey, like, you are a good job at coaching and understanding and helping people reason with their strengths, right? You should lean into that more. Here's the other opportunity area for you. So without that push, right, I don't think I would have been able to really tap into that. And who knows how many years it would have taken right before I figured it out. So yeah, I definitely agree. I think having someone, even if it's a small little nudge, was that kind of awakening moment, I guess, for me. And then Michael, yeah, what do you think?
Being a father of 3 grown adults and pushing regularly for them, through middle school and high school for sports, being an ex-floor trader with over 100 employees hired and fired, and you're always sort of pushing people or letting them understand what they're good at and why they should reach out and do things. And as a boss, you're always not trying to sort of hover over people, let people do their thing and sometimes fail, but they learn from that. So to me, a superhero, a mentor, whatever you want to call it, is someone who helps other people to find their powers and do the right thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a basic leadership skill, right?
Yes, for sure. Like, being overly just sitting on top of employees or sitting on top of people and inspecting everything they do is not, doesn't work at all. It's not the right thing. And then people just fail to reach their potential, and they're always worried about what their boss is going to say or what mom or dad is going to say. I'll tell you just a quick 30-second story. My son used to ask for permission for a lot of things, and I finally said to him, why don't you just go and do it? I said, because you can ask for forgiveness after. I said, but just take a shot here. Like, I may say no, but why don't you just go do it and figure it out yourself?
Good, very good. Yeah, so if we kind of in agreement about those superpowers now, as I mentioned before, before we are jumping into the next area, I wanted to tell something about those superpowers, right? So in many cases, when we are talking about those superheroes and their powers and how they can be very successful, we forget something else that I like. I saw many interviews with Stanley. I think that if you get into the mind behind his answers, it's very nice. So one sentence I heard from Stanley at those interviews is that just because a person has a superpower, it doesn't mean he might not have the same problem you or I have, right? So this is something to remember as mentors, from the sort of a personal perspective, that we have to understand that those guys might be, very smart, very powerful, very successful, but they have also regular life. They are multidimensional. They have daily challenges. Sometimes it's with their spouse, sometimes it's with their hobbies, sometimes the family and friends and so on. Okay, so that is kind of just a reminder that as mentors, in order to get into the right level of partnership with the founders, we need to remember that sort of multidimensionality and understand that sometimes a person can have a bad day, as you know, even if he is a superhero, right? So that was just one kind of side note to those powers. And now, you know, once we kind of in agreement and alignment around that, going back to Brian, actually, what you ask is that how do we make sure that those powers are sufficient to complete the task? And in order to understand the task, I would, you know, consider the task as kind of the villain. So in a way, those superhero, what are they trying to do? Who are they fighting? How are they going to bring the good in life? And the question is, you know, first question is, must the hero win, right? So if we think just outside the box for a second, when we watch a movie, do we want a happy end for that movie? Do we always have to watch movies with happy ends? And I think that sometimes us as mentor needs to understand that it's not about winning or happy end that always happens, because, you know, in real life, unfortunately, there is not always a case of win. And I would take out the word must and you know, replace it with a question that we should ask as mentor: can the hero win, right? Like, is it really possible that the hero will be successful? So in order to understand that, I think the first piece is to understand who are the villain, right? Now, a little bit of a story about that. One of the founders I was working with, she is a super talented individual. Part of let's call it a sort of a minority group in the population, and I already mentioned she. And usually when we spoke about the problem or the challenges, the claim was that the challenges are always somehow related to her being, like, you know, in a minority group, right? Which, you know, I'm not underestimating. I know it's, you know, diversity is a big topic, but is that really the problem, right? Is it really the problem? Or like, is the problem is really maybe with the idea, with the business approach? Maybe the idea is that when people ask for the competitors, then, you know, if someone is saying, oh, I don't have a competitor, right? That's not a good answer usually, to say that there are no competitors. So in many ways, you know, out of my experience with different founders and different type of businesses, I didn't, by the way, mention that at the introduction. I used to work both with the largest companies on earth, the top 10, 20 companies, as well as with startup and small companies. So I have like different perspective in businesses. But, you know, through my work with superheroes, founders, I found that many of them are not necessarily getting a good understanding of who is the real villain, and what is really, like, you know, the way to tackle a problem. In many ways, I think we as mentors, we need to understand, like, what are challenges, what are weaknesses, and, you know, who are the villains, right? And we need to help the founders to understand, okay, this is your powers, this is your ideas, those are your weaknesses, and those are your challenges, and we need to separate between them, right? We need to separate between, like, a personal problem, or maybe a financial problem. I don't have enough funds to do X, Y, or Z, versus maybe challenges that are in the market, or challenges that in the idea, or the ability to execute. And one big question that we need to discuss mutually, of course, is, does the superhero have enough powers to win, right? And that's, Brian, exactly to your question. You know, we can open that for a conversation, but I will actually jump to the next slide, because once we're thinking if the superhero has enough power to win, that's literally where we need to say, well, you know, it's not just the individual power that the founder is bringing with him, it's also internal and external environment that the superhero is a part of, right? And then to your question back, like, what do you do with a group of superheroes, right? A group of co-founders. I think that's the place where you can say, well, I'm going into the sort of the internal type of activities and trying to take all of them into a sort of a bootstrapping activity and look 360 degrees and see, like, how those mutual powers help to overcome some challenges that are together, right? And I think that's exactly the point where you need to move from more like, the one-on-one type of conversation into a sort of a group effort. Group effort in many ways is not just the internal validation or bootstrapping of an idea. It's also what is outside that can help the superhero to win. One area that I believe that we as mentors needs to be very active and have is the collaborations. And that's a big topic to discuss. It's the whole idea about partnerships, right? In our world, when economy is a little bit more difficult, both recruiting money and maybe selling and so on, one way to leverage capabilities is really to find the right collaborations. And I definitely think that as mentors, one of our strengths is that we usually come in with a lot of experience, with some networks, and helping collaboration between founders and potential business partners is a key idea and a key way to take the source powers that already there with the founders and leveraging them, with our network. By nature, the other area is to really think about the strategy and the business model, and who is a client, who is a customer, what channels are there, and partners. So this is literally to open eyes and in many ways also to speak about other co-founders and other people that are around that can make the challenge or can beat the villains. Any question about that? Do we want to open that a little bit for a conversation, or if not, there is going to be a couple of more conversation in the next couple of slides.
No, I mean, I think that was great, right? And going to that last slide, which you talked about too, about does the superhero have, enough powers to kind of, or like, are they capable, right? Do they have what it takes to win? And to me, that's a lot about like when you see on pitch decks, right? And when founding teams meet with VCs, right? That's, who is the founding team? Who is the team that's capable of doing this? Why do you want to, why should you trust us with your money, right? And that comes to, especially with earlier stage companies, right? When you look at pre-seed and seed, it's why are you, right? The idea might not be completely innovative. There's probably at least a few other ideas out there. Why are you the team to make this happen, right? And that's where you talk about those different superhero strengths that the founding team has. And if you don't understand it, for yourselves, how are you going to be able to convey that to investors, right? To family offices, to whoever, to prove why you're deserving of their money and resources, right? And so I think that's a good understanding. Like this is a great kind of baseline for how founders should look at themselves to be able to determine how they can speak about their strengths to others in the community.
Right. And I think the other reason that I put the villain in place, because everyone know that, okay, I'm coming with an innovative idea to overcome a specific challenge or market opportunity, right? We all know about that. I think that sometimes that founders forget about the risks, right? So I think the reason that I'm putting a villain in place is to make sure that we as mentor explain that, okay, if there is a business need, a market opportunity, and we have the best solution for that, it still doesn't mean that it's a safe win, right? There are a lot of pieces in between and a lot of challenges that we need to make sure that the founders knows how to overcome, and we have to make sure that they have those powers and connections and collaboration pieces to go through those type of risks. And it is not just making sure that you have the right solution. So, if we're talking about the story itself, right? So we spoke about the founders, by nature, his power, his idea, the villains. Now we need to put all together in a story. And Brian, I really like your answer about, how are we going to the VC? Because literally, when we're going to the VC and we want to recruit the money, then we need to tell a story, right? And we need to tell a story. Where have we been, 30 years ago, and we know what's going to happen in the next 2, 3, 5, and 20 years with this idea. So I wanted to speak about the third, let's call the facet about the storyteller. And again, I want to start with the right side of the slide. I will quickly read that. That's like, a standard sort of a definition of a good storyteller, right? You sometimes tell about people, oh, he is a great storyteller. So what do you mean? You mean that the storyteller can distill complex data and results into simple examples that colleagues, policymakers, and investors can readily understand. The storyteller has the skill for making ideas to stick, right? So a guy that is a storyteller, he's like the guy that everyone understands and gets what he needs. The way Stan Lee was talking about the storyteller, he said, well, a storyteller is not a guy that is reading the audience and know what they want to hear and how to deliver them a message. Stan Lee is saying, I am not different than other people, and that's why I write to please myself. And I'm reading that every time I've written a story, I've always tried to write the sort of story that I myself would enjoy reading, right? So those are like two different approaches, right? One approach is saying, well, if I hear a story from a superhero, do I enjoy it, right? Can I take a message and amplify it or change it to make the story look better? Should I do that, right? And maybe another question around that is it really compelling? Do I really get it, right? Now, if I not get it, is another person will understand it. And that's, literally what Stanley is saying. He says, I'm not trying to please someone else. If I enjoy the story, I believe there are enough people that will enjoy the story by themselves. So one message to me here is, if we believe to the approach of Stanley, is I think that we as a mentor need to make sure that we understand the story first and we enjoy it. I think that marketing experts can tell you that they can make every story, every product be successful, right? They can always build the bells and whistles around an idea and make it nice. But can we as mentors be really effective if we don't enjoy the story, right? So I think that's kind of a big question to ask ourselves. Can we help any startup, or do we need to feel engaged with it? Now, the second level of that is a little bit more complicated, and that's again about our role as mentors. Should a mentor judge or write the story, right? Is it my role as a mentor to go to that superhero and help him to redefine or judge or say, oh, you have a bad idea, right? Is it my role or not? I'm just, the guy who tried to orchestrate and make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in terms of answering this question too, that's kind of where you determine how hands-on is a mentor versus like an advisor versus someone on the board of directors versus, a not even official relation, but just a friend or family member. And I think to me, at least when I look at like the ideal role of a mentor, there's times when the mentor, either will maybe hold the hand a little bit more, or kind of it's like helping the superhero find their awakening, right? Helping the founders find it themselves, because the mentor's not going to be, right? They're not the founders, right? They're not necessarily the employees. They're the ones that can kind of, to me, a good coach, a good mentor is someone who can stand on the sidelines and help the founder or help the person figure it out themselves, right? So maybe that's not the right answer. So I don't think a mentor should necessarily write the story, but they can help put the framework together for the founders to understand themselves.
Yeah. By nature, right, we're having an open conversation. I think the idea is literally to think about our role and activities and how we're making sure that we have that 360 degrees approach. And we just because, I think we do have some time limitation here. I do want to give my 2 cents here. And I think that from the mentorship perspective, I 100% agree, right? It depends how hands-on are you as a mentor and what areas of expertise you bring into the table. But one thing that, we as mentors cannot leave away is at least the validation of the story, right? So we don't necessarily have to write it, we not necessarily need to advise about it, but we as mentors need to make sure that there is a validation to the storyline. And if some pieces are missing in the story, like if you read the story without, a good beginning, then you need to tell something to the writer. Hey, you need to give me some background so I will understand, the plot. What is a good validation? A good validation needs to make sure that we know where is the story takes place, right? And that means like, what market are we at? That's very basic. And again, once I'm saying it's very basic, I'm sure that some of you have been in cases where someone came with a good idea, but he doesn't know where he's going to sell it or which exact market. Oh, it's like a healthcare product, but hey, healthcare is huge, right? Let's be a little bit more focused. The second piece is like the impact, right? And the impact is different. I think we need to help within that story understand who are the buyers and who is the audience. And now it's not always the same. Buyer and audience, not always the same people. A university can buy a product for its students, right? So it could be that the buyer will be the university, but the audience is not the university. It's literally the students that might need that type of a service, right? Then we want to think a little bit about the special tools the hero has or need, right? Like in a way, what exactly are those type of technology or other components that are in there? And if they are not special, then what is the differentiation? So another way is to make sure that we understand the differentiation of the idea. We spoke about the villains and how to defeat them, but we have to make sure that those risks, right, are in the storyline. We already spoke about the powers, but we need to also making sure that in that storyline, we know that we introduce the powers, but also introduce the help that we're getting with others to use those powers. And last but not least, again, what are the risks that might not be necessarily from entities like villains, but who might get hurt, right, from that? What happens if it fails? That's like, the Superman's kryptonite in a way. So that's something that we need to do in terms of the story. We need to validate. I do believe that the mentor needs to make sure that all the pieces are there and there is like a 360-degree type of an approach. So to quickly wrap up the conversation, some key takeaway. And again, the whole idea was to speak a little bit about the ideas and to make sure that we're getting the full picture. And I think that because we're consider mentorship as a sort of a very intimate type of conversation, the goal is to be in a situation that we get mutual respect. Now, I haven't spoke about that during that whole session, but from the starting point of understanding the superhero and the multidimensionality and introducing ourselves, I think we need to get into that mutual respect. I don't think we can do a good mentorship work without having that in place. And then the second piece, as I mentioned, understanding our founder, making sure that we have been identified risks and how we beat those risks. By the way, sometimes just living with a risk is also an idea, but at least it's being kind of documented and considered. We have to understand, are we really adding value to the founders and the superheroes? So literally how we empower them, and as we just ended up, validating the story. So that's literally, kind of the summary of all the idea, that if we becoming trusted mentors and trusted advisor to the founder, and we have the 360 degrees, we can really help and become a very significant part of the hero's success. I like to kind of end this conversation with a question that to me is probably one of the most challenging questions for mentors. And it's like, does the mentor need to please the superhero? So I know that we are maybe 1 minute after the time that's set, but
No, we're good. We technically have until 12 as it's
Oh, okay.
scheduled. So, yeah, so we actually, obviously, if people need to leave, they can, but yeah, you're still good on time, so we can definitely have a Q&A.
Perfect. So we can open, for general conversation and discussion for sure, or we can actually start and ask, whoever here on the session, like, is our goal or task as mentor is to please the superhero, is to make sure that he is happy.
Yeah, that's a great. And actually, I someone sent in a question who couldn't be here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask this question first, and then I'll answer separately. So someone had asked, what's the worst thing? I guess what's like the do not do's between a mentor and a founder that you would kind of recommend seeing? Right? Is it like the mentor too overbearing? Is it the founder not being honest? Or like what are the kind of the things to avoid to make sure you have a healthy mentor founder relationship?
Wow, I think that's
I'm sure there's a lot.
yeah. So I think, like almost with every profession, we can speak about the long list of to do and not to do in a way, right? But if I go back to the previous slide, I really think that mentorship is all about the trusted relationships. So the way I would try to, if I just need to give one answer for that, right, and one topic, I would say don't get into a partnership, I'm sorry, to a mentorship, long-term or even short-term relationship if you can't get those trusted relationship early in the game. Sometimes when I train some people over sales processes, I said to them, the first demo that you're doing with a customer is like a blind date, right? This is like the first impression. If it goes well, it doesn't mean that you will be successful and will be able to close a deal, but it gives you a better chance to continue the relationships, right? And I think that in many ways, if I'm going back to your question, I think you have to make sure that in a way the blind date was successful, so the initial engagement was good. I think after the initial engagement, you have to understand that there is like a sort of a trusted relationship that can build up over time. And if you feel that you're not getting as a mentor appreciated enough or trusted enough, or you feel that this is, I think you mentioned also, like you feel a bit of a dishonesty, don't be there. That would be kind of and because it's not going to be successful, right? Now it go both ways, right? If you don't believe in the powers of your hero, then don't support it, right? It's not that you have to be a mentor. It's not something, it's not a task that must be done. I think you have to do it once you feel that the engagement is good and you trust the company and the people you advise. So those trusted relationship, to me, that's the go, no go of the games. Most of the other problems you can resolve over time.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I see a few other guys on the call. I don't know if you want to share some feedback, ideas, thoughts, challenges you had.
Well, I'll actually speak.
Yeah.
So to me, a mentor, maybe it's not like a blind date, because a blind date, you're never going to be sort of critical of someone on the first time. And as a mentor, you're sort of supposed to be a little critical of them. And if you're always telling them how great they are and never pointing out things that they can improve on or things that they may have looked at wrong or made a mistake. So you have to be, completely honest with someone as a mentor. And that's what you're there for. Like, you're not there to just tell them how great they are and, they're successful and they're good looking and they're whatever. Like, it's just, that's not what it's about. Some people don't want to hear things like that, but that's, I'm the kind of guy, when I'm buying something, I'm looking at the negative reviews and looking for details, not that this is horrible or one-liners or, curse words. I'm looking for, detail and why this product is bad or doesn't work or doesn't, work with this particular product. So as a mentor, you have to be very straightforward with people, and that's what works. And most mentees want to hear things like that. They want to understand where they can improve and what they're good at and what to do. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I'm 100%. I think maybe that's a good feedback. When I was talking about that type of a blind date, I think that was for the initial engagement, right? So I think you can't be, you can, of course, but it's more difficult to be challenging in the first meeting. I think
Sure.
in order to be critic, you need to work on the relationships a little bit. You need to make sure that you understand each other very well. And then, it's literally part of your job, as you mentioned, to be critic. And that's going back to the question on the screen, right? That's the place where we probably do not have to please the superhero. So I think we do need to make some effort to build the trust and maybe hold on some of our thoughts. But once we feel in a trusted relationship, that's the place to put all those in.
Absolutely. And I think that comes to just as much as the founder, right? And being coachable. Like a lot of people can say they want a mentor, an advisor, because maybe their conception of what a mentor advisor does is skewed. And I know I've run into this a lot of times in other scenarios where you see a founder say, hey, like, yeah, my mentor's going to introduce me to these people, or they're going to help get me new customers, things like that, which isn't right necessarily the role of a mentor, because if the relationship's good and then the mentor feels just as invested as the founder at times, sure, the mentor is more open to doing things like that, right? But if the founder themselves are not coachable or willing to kind of take that advice to heart, we're not going to say mentor's advice is 100% always correct, right? Depending on the mentor. But as long as the founder's open to learning and kind of seeing what that advice looks like in relation to their business, then yeah, I think that opens it up for that two-way street of learning. So the mentor's not necessarily pleasing the superhero, but the superhero can actually take a lot from the conversation without getting their feelings hurt, right? Or right, it's business, right? So you need to be able to take that to heart.
Yeah. It reminds me a conversation I had with a father I was working with, and she, right? They mentioned to me something interesting. They said, Liran, this is your time to prove yourself. And I was a bit surprised, right? Because I think that, it's not always in that game. I think it's really the founder's duty to prove himself. But, when I being told by a founder, it's my time to prove myself, it was really hitting me like, in a way of like, that's interesting, right? I never thought about that from that perspective. The question here, should we please our founders or superheroes, was literally coming out of that, because when I kind of being told like that, I think that from a nature perspective, I wanted immediately to answer back and to say, no, it's your time to prove yourself. I already did something, right? But again, that's part of sometimes the interactions, and how do you reach into a person that might not be so coachable and prove him that the mutual work together is beneficial.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. I know we've got the last kind of couple minutes here, but so my kind of final question for you as we kind of wrap this up too is, what inspired you to, well, I guess, yeah, thanks. So you've got the slide here. If you're interested, you can obviously reach out to Dr. Edelist on the information there. But what kind of, as the final prompt, what motivated you to really kind of want to speak about this issue, right? Was there like a specific mentor you had or a relationship you had? Like why, mentorship and superheroes, what inspired you to kind of lead this workshop?
Yeah, so I think my interactions with different founders is already a couple of decades old. I also consider myself as a founder with a couple of companies I was running. But over the past couple of weeks was, in a way, my most intense experience with multiple type of founders. at some point during those interactions, I felt that I'm missing something. I'm not exactly at the point where I need to be. And I try to understand why isn't it, right? And many of the topics that I raised here are coming out of 25 years of experience, but mostly a very intense year of working with different founders and try to kind of explaining myself where are the kind of the breaking points of the relationship with a founder, and also where are the peak points and how you can sometimes make a break point into a peak point. So I thought that it's going to be beneficial. I also believe that, there is no, I don't think there is like a quick cookbook for that, or an easy answer from ChatGPT that can say, okay, what do I need to do to be a good mentor? I guess that if we will ask ChatGPT, we'll get an answer for that. But it's really more about like the human aspect, the way to think about that, the way to be creative with the mindset and the approach. And literally what I try to do here is to have all of us kind of thinking about, that idea in a little bit more relaxed theme of like superheroes, which is always a bit fun. So it's not too heavy, not taking, models from university and making it too boring, but also making it fun and collaborative and, hear other people's thoughts and share my personal experience.
That's great. And yeah, thank you again for hosting. And everyone, obviously, I'll watch the recording. Feel free to reach out. Dr. Liran Edelist's LinkedIn and information's there, but excited to hear more from this as kind of the series grows. And thanks so much for your time, and we're looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here and also be part of the great community.
Of course. All right, cheers. Michael, did you have something?
No, I was trying to hit the emoji of clapping, so I'll just do like this.
There you go.
It's
All
much
right.
better than emoji to see you doing that.
All right, well, thanks so much again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.